Okay, welcome to those who are joining us. We're just going to wait a few seconds to let a couple more people in. Okay. Okay, I think we can get started. Welcome to those who have joined us. It looks like a few more people are still entering, but we're going to get started. This is the book launch for Disruptive Prisoners by Chris Clarkson and Melissa Munn. My name is Anna Delcall. I work for University of Toronto Press. And before I hand this over to our co-hosts at the Old Jail Museum, I just wanted to do a land acknowledgement for the University of Toronto Press. So UTP, for thousands of years, the land that we currently operate on have been the traditional lands of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. And today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. And we're very grateful at UTP to have the opportunity to work on this land. So to officially get this virtual book launch started, I'd like to hand things over to Barbara Doyle from the Old Jail Museum. Barbara, over to you.
Thanks so much, Anna. Welcome everybody to this incredible book launch. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day-to-day to join us. We at the Old Jail Museum are based in the city of Kawartha Lakes in Lindsay, Ontario, and we're coming from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, settled under treaty, the Williams Treaty under 1818. So today's event is based on the launch of this fantastic book, Disruptive Prisoners, and it was brought to our attention from University of Toronto Press, so thank you so much. And I found it an incredible book, and I really wanted to share it with everybody in our community, as we at the Old Jail have such a strong connection through our building to corrections and prison reform, and in our local community, as we still have the East Corrections Facility here in Lindsay. So to get us started, we're going to have a presentation by both authors, Chris Clarkson and Melissa Munn, and then it'll be followed by a Q&A as well, and you can put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen so that we can answer them at the end of the presentation. And I just wanted to introduce our authors. Today we've got Chris Clarkson, who is a professor in the Department of History, and Melissa Munn, who's a professor in the Department of Sociology at Okanagan College in British Columbia. So thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to throw it over to you now, because really people just want to hear from you and about your amazing book and how it came to be. So welcome, Chris and Melissa, and over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for being our co-host, and to U of T Press. And thank you all for joining us today. We're always super keen to talk about this topic, and it's nice after all these years of writing the book not to be just talking to each other. So we designed today's presentation to highlight a few of the main themes of our book. We can't cover it all, obviously. We're going to try and talk to you about it for about half an hour and then have the Q&A after. So the three things that we're going to try and highlight in this presentation today is what were the motives for prison reform? What types of reforms were put in place in the 1950s? And we really want to highlight the disconnect between the official image of reform and the lived experience of prisoners. And the experience of prisoners is represented for us through the writings they did in the penal press, and we'll talk more about that after. There's going to be, as I mentioned, a Q&A after the presentation, but we have a question for you to consider as we present. Some of you are workers in the system. Some of you are former prisoners. Some of you who have family members who were or are incarcerated. Some of you are academics, and some of you are just interested in the history of prisons. And it's going to be the same question for all of you. We're going to be talking about 1935 to 1960, but our question for you is, has anything changed? Could we be doing the same presentation about the past 20 years?
There we go. So this book started with,
Hi, Chris. Chris, sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
We can't quite hear you. If you can lean forward a little more towards the mic. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll start. Can you hear me now?
Not yet.
Oh, we are.
Okay, hold on. You could hear me though?
I could hear you crystal clear.
Okay. Come on over, Chris.
Maybe I'll have to move over when it's my
That's
turn.
perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect.
So this book started with a gift that Bob Gaucher, a criminology professor at the University of Ottawa, gave to Melissa several years ago. It was a collection of penal press magazines and newsletters that Bob and Claire Culhane had collected over a long period of time, and that Bob had sought out over a long period of time, over decades. And Melissa, when she got this collection, contacted me about writing a book about the penal press, about these newspapers and newsletters. And so when she suggested that project, I started looking into other sources so that we could find the context for the newsletters and put together a better kind of background for the creation of those newsletters and for what they meant. And as I began looking into the National Archives in Ottawa, Library and Archives Canada, I stumbled upon a significant collection of records there created by the Penitentiary Service and its wardens. And that sent us on our first trip to Ottawa. And we began to look into those records, and you can see them on your screen there. We found about 10,000 pages of materials on the creation of the penal press. We found materials documenting wardens' conferences that were held. We found material that was letters, comprised of letters between wardens all across the country and the superintendent and then commissioner of penitentiaries. We found accounting records. We also started to find material media coverage of prisons and reforms. And many of those documents had never been used by historians before. And so as we found that material, I think it became evident to both of us that we could do a lot more than write a history of the penal press. We could write a history of the prison system using the documents that we'd found at the National Archives and using the documents that have been created by prisoners. We had the documents of both penal administrators and prisoners, and we thought that we could create a history of the prison system that took both perspectives into account.
So let's start with the historical context. The 1950s was a period of reform on campus, but the origins of that program can be traced back to the penitentiary riots that happened in the 1930s. In a one-year period between 1932 and 1933, there were riots at 4 Canadian prisons: Dorchester, Stony Mountain, St. Vincent de Paul, and Kingston. When the riot leaders at Kingston Penitentiary were put on trial, the media paid attention, and this exposed the conditions at that prison to public scrutiny. The public now knew that prisoners lived in silence, were confined in their cells up to 23 hours a day, couldn't read because of dim lighting in the cells. They were brutally punished and sometimes confined in isolation for months on end. The resulting public demands for an inquiry led the government to appoint the Archambault Commission to investigate the prison system in 1936.
The Archambault Commission reported in 1938, and it recommended that prison administrators take a humane approach. The commissioners called for improved conditions, and they called for rehabilitation programs. But the reforms would have to wait because the commission reported in 1938, and the following year, Canada went to war in 1939. That long delay might have killed any interest in reform and in following the Archambault Commission's recommendations. The war didn't end until 1945, and by the time it ended, it was 13 years after the original riots, and it was 7 years after the report had been released. So the public should have forgotten about the Archambault Commission and its recommendations. It was a long, long lapse. But during the war, there was a nationwide scare over rising rates of juvenile delinquency. And that fear, whether justified or not, kept people thinking about the Royal Commission. And they kept thinking about that commission because it had recommended special institutions for young offenders. So when the war ended, people were still thinking about the report, and the government faced renewed public pressure, as you can see on your screen here, from women's organizations, from churches, from social work organizations, from the labor movement. The government then appointed General Ralph Gibson to be Commissioner of Penitentiaries, and he was given instructions to begin the process of implementing the reforms. And I think there's an important lesson here, that prison reform in Canada was the result of long-term public pressure.
So this new deal in Canada, what were the reforms for? Probably the highlight of the changes were the recreation programs. There were organized sports. Softball was by far the most popular, but prisoners played basketball and hockey and participated in
Melissa, sorry, it's Jane from University of Toronto Press. We can't hear you. So I'm going to have to ask both of you to move closer together, just so that when either of you speak, you're speaking closer into the microphone.
Okay.
Oh, much better. Thank you.
Okay. Closer. It's a good thing we still like each other after writing this book. So the question became, what were the reforms? And the highlights of the reform for prisoners probably was the sports program. Prisoners played baseball. They played basketball, hockey. They participated in weightlifting and boxing. Evening recreation was allowed in some prisons. It was outside in the summertime and in the corridors during the winter. You could see them playing board games, etc. A radio system was installed. The silent system gave way to loudspeakers that drove some prisoners crazy. Movies were shown monthly. Prisoners were permitted to subscribe to newspapers that were uncensored. Prior to that, they could only get certain newsletters and they were censored content. Cell lighting was improved, and the amount of debate and discussion around the wattage and cord length was outstanding. They began a hobbycraft program that continues to today. In 1950, they started with 800 people participating in hobbycraft.
The penitentiary service also initiated new rehabilitative programs in the 1950s. Those new programs were focused on education and vocational training. That was the central focus. The idea was that a prisoner with new skills would be able to find a decent paying job when they got out and would be less likely to reoffend. As a result, educational facilities were improved throughout the penitentiary system. They built new multi-purpose buildings at almost all of the penitentiaries, and in those buildings you would find better schools, new libraries, auditoriums, and gymnasiums. At the same time, the industrial shops were expanded and modernized throughout the prison system. Prisoners in the vocational training program could gain apprenticeship credit that counted on the outside, and they could gain apprenticeship credit in trades like mechanics and carpentry and plumbing.
The classification system was introduced. It compiled case histories on each prisoner and determined their educational needs and their work and training placements. After the riots in the 30s, prisoners began to be paid 5 cents a day. In the new reforms in 1951, pay was raised, and they introduced a graduated pay scale with 3 steps. They were set at 10, 15, and 20 cents a day for their labor. For comparison purposes, the average daily wage in Canada in 1950 was $7 a day. Make no mistake, the pay grades were to serve as a mechanism of control. Prisoners earned more if they were productive and making satisfactory progress towards rehabilitative goals. Canteens were opened at each prison where prisoners could purchase small items like snacks and magazines, sort of like a convenience store. It all seems progressive if you don't look too closely. But as we'll see next, the prisoners did look closely. For the public, the most visible manifestation of the New Deal was the penal press. Prisoners were permitted to produce their own newspapers. The first publication was Telescope in 1950 at Kingston Penitentiary. It was supposed to be a trial experiment, but it was a huge success. Within a year, outside subscriptions, those sold to the public, were permitted. And by the end of 1953, Telescope had 400 outside subscribers, and its contents were the subject of regular commentary in the mainstream press. Given Telescope's success, other magazines were initiated in each of Canada's penitentiaries. There were 6 by 1952 and 8 different publications by the end of the decade.
Why did the administration want the penal press? Well, their aims are summarized in the 5 points on this PowerPoint. And the last point in that list, to provide a conduit for constructive criticism and cooperation between prisoners and the administration, is especially important to us today. And it's one of the points that the
Hey, Chris.
Yes.
Sorry, it's Jane again.
Yep.
Sorry, we couldn't hear what you had been saying for your segment there.
Okay.
Okay, oh, much better. Okay, thanks.
This is very weird.
It's strange that it keeps cutting out like that. Well, what I started with was why the administration wanted the penal press. And there's a list of points there, the things that, the aims that they had for the penal press. And the most important of those aims, and one that was actually provided for them by a prisoner, was to provide a conduit for constructive criticism and cooperation between prisoners and the administration. That was the most important point for the administration. It's one that they constantly emphasized. Prisoners, however, would make use of the penal press for their own purposes. And the press tells us a lot. The press tells us what prisoners thought of laws and policies and programs, but it tells us more than that. It tells us how the programs were actually implemented and how they might be improved. The other thing that the press shows us is that prisoners and administrators often didn't see things the same way. And that was a problem because the press was read by members of the public and it was read by the media.
The tone of the early penal press was optimistic. There was a sense of amazement among the prison editors at the nature of the early changes taking place within the penitentiary system. And they were hopeful about future changes. In general, commentary in the early penal press is both critical and helpful. It was constructive in nature. Writers and commentators wanted to assist in creation of better programming. Here's an example written by Pete Stasiak in the Telescope in 1951. Though we realize it's only the beginning, we sincerely appreciate the steps now being taken towards rehabilitation and look forward with great interest to further development of the plan. That statement includes 2 key points. One is a genuine appreciation for the changes that had taken place, and 2, and this is an important one, that was the expectation that more change was coming.
At the same time, there were also signs that penal press exchange columns would be an agent of significant change within the prisons. Prison administrators allowed the prisoners access to magazines from other institutions. And noteworthy pieces from both Canada and the United States were often reprinted in the local magazines, as were items from the mainstream press. The information that went into those columns had significant consequences in terms of prisoners' expectations. There were almost immediately demands for uniformity of conditions. And there was also an opportunity in those columns to spread new ideas and new modes of thinking.
Meanwhile, as time passed, the tone of the press shifted. Wardens were not happy. On occasion, they ordered the removal of pages or destroyed entire issues, entire print runs. But prisoners found a way to resist. In some cases, the material that was banned seems quite benign. This piece we found in one of the warden's files. It was never allowed to be published. It was written from the perspective of a prison cell, and it highlights the unchanging nature of prisons, something the administration clearly did not want to admit was happening. Such conflicts meant that the early sense of optimism and possibility diminished, and it was often replaced by despondency and condemnation. Prisoner James Carleton made this clear in 1954. He said, "I have learned that the term rehabilitation is a meaningless word and that recidivism is the natural result of prison. I admit that I am afraid of what I have learned of prison life. I hope I can find a way back to the respectability and happiness. There is a long road to travel by sincere thinking people who want to make rehabilitation a reality and not a hollow word in Canadian penology."
Well, why was James Carleton so disillusioned? Why did he refer to rehabilitation as a meaningless and hollow word? Why were other prisoners joining him in that criticism? I think it's fair to say that the image of the New Deal, of all that change in the Canadian prison system, concealed as much as it revealed.
The first problem was overcrowding. In the early 1950s, the federal prison population across Canada, and especially in Ontario and Quebec, had risen to undesirable levels, and it continued to rise. Prisoners were being transferred from one region to another to relieve overcrowded conditions, but it didn't help. During a warden's conference, Warden Cummings didn't mix words. He said overcrowding impacted everything, and it overshadows every effort that we make.
Secondly, the pace of reform was slow. The promised reforms were slow to materialize and were not available to all prisoners. In fact, some of the most important reforms were available to only a select few prisoners. We're going to go back and look at two of the most important elements in the rehabilitation program: education and training. Progress in education was slow. Prior to the Archambault report, so prior to the 1930s, prison education focused on prisoners who couldn't read. In the 1950s, prison schools remained focused on basic literacy. Prisoners who wanted an education beyond the most basic level were directed to take correspondence courses, which they had to complete on their own time, outside of work hours, and in cells with other prisoners out in the hall, participating in recreation and with radio loudspeakers going and all of that. So very difficult. In 1953, Commissioner Gibson admitted that educational activity had not developed much beyond the traditional pattern of the past. And as he made his reports over the rest of the decade, it became very clear that little had occurred which would have changed that assessment. There were new buildings. Little new was taking place within them, though. The situation with vocational training was similar. Only a small group of prisoners were able to take advantage of the vocational training opportunities, the trades training opportunities. By the mid-1950s, about 300 to 350 men out of a total population of 5,000 could participate. You couldn't participate if you didn't have a grade 8 education. You were inadmissible, and you couldn't get that level of education in the classrooms in the prison system. You had to do it yourself through correspondence courses. Prisoners under 30 weren't admitted, so you had to be a mature prisoner to participate in the vocational prisons. And that slide that you see in front of you, it's there for a reason. It was in the commissioner's report, and it makes it look like a lot was going on in the prison system, but it's actually there for what's not on it. The three of the most important prisons in the country aren't on that slide because they didn't have any vocational programs. There were none at Kingston Penitentiary, there were none at St. Vincent de Paul, and there were none at Manitoba Penitentiary. Perhaps I should have stated the statistics in reverse. In the average year, over 4,600 of 5,000 prisoners weren't participating in the vocational training program. And even worse, if you were sentenced to 4 years or less, and most prisoners in the 1950s in the federal prison system had sentences of under 4 years, you couldn't participate at all. As Commissioner Gibson wrote, In his 1955 annual report, there is no room or opportunity for training during the average sentence, which is disappointing to the inmate, to his parents, and to those responsible for the vocational program.
So let's step back and think about what this means. Certainly, conditions in the 1950s were better than they were in the 1920s and 30s, but only in some respects. New privileges had been introduced, but prisoners still lived in overcrowded conditions, were not receiving education or work-related training that they had been promised. It's no wonder that James Carleton saw the idea of rehabilitation as a sham. There was a lot more talk than actual opportunity. Despite the disillusionment expressed in the press, there was no significant indication that anything was seriously wrong at Kingston in 1954, until August, when the prisoners rioted. The army was called in and order was restored within a few hours, but the property damage was extensive. There is some indication that the fire may have started in the telescope offices and that the publication itself was used as kindling. Commissioner Gibson was perplexed as to the causes. How could he explain it, given the reforms he'd been bragging about for the previous half decade?
Well, the commissioner chose to attribute the cause and the responsibility for the riot to a small group of people that he referred to as psychopaths, who wielded a disproportionate influence in the tense and overcrowded conditions at Kingston Penitentiary. And that interpretation seems to have been accepted by the mainstream press. It was an interpretation that had consequences. There were immediate calls for the construction of a super maximum security penitentiary in Canada for the segregation of these antisocial, psychopathic prisoners. And prison officials started to react. They began to segregate so-called psychopathic prisoners within institutions, existing institutions, and they began to exclude them from the rehabilitation programs. They also started to use electroconvulsive treatments much more extensively than they had in the past. So the riot really brought some changes. The riot also caused the first large-scale public controversy over the content of the penal press. In December of 1954, Deputy Commissioner Ralph March wrote a memo, and you can see the memo on your screen there, which raised a series of objections to the most recent issue of Transition magazine, a magazine that was printed at BC Penn. In that issue, Transition editor Al Sieben took issue with the suggestions that Canada build a super maximum security prison to deal with the incorrigible leaders, the psychopathic leaders of the Kingston riot. Sieben asked, how far have we progressed? Is the net result a Canadian type of Alcatraz? Al Sieben challenged the idea of incorrigibility. He emphasized the influence of environment and upbringing on people's characters, and he concluded, today, the movement to build an Alcatraz is indeed a sad foreboding of the wisdom and understanding of our authorities. Instead, they should raise the monstrous prisons of today. They should build prisons where so-called incorrigibles can regain their self-respect and human dignity. Al Sieben was looking at the nature versus nurture debate and saying, there are no incorrigibles. There are people who have been exposed to conditions that have brought them to the place that they're at, and we can change that. Well, that issue, it was never allowed to be circulated, and Transition's entire staff resigned in protest. Here are their complaints. As they explained to the local warden, they felt that unless the paper expressed the wishes of the prisoners, it would lose its value.
So the publication of Transition was suspended. The Vancouver Sun reported that the editorial staff had resigned rather than delete objectionable articles, as advised by the warden. Meanwhile, the deputy commissioner expressed his concerns about the changing tone of the press at a warden's conference in 1955. Thanks to an absolutely brilliant, fantastic stenographer, we have a verbatim transcript of that exchange. When March contended that that sort of thing has no place in an inmate publication, another warden responded, "It may be true, though. March was forced to concede the point. For Commissioner Gibson, though, the most important thing wasn't truth, it was public perception. And he announced that he would issue a set of guidelines to the editorial boards. In 1955, a new transition board was appointed. Publication resumed in July 1955 under the new guidelines that were furnished to them by the Commissioner's office.
The New Westminster, British Columbia, and the Vancouver Herald both carried pieces on the resumption of the transitions publication. The Herald reported that the revived magazine was, and I quote,
Chris,
yeah.
we're sorry, we can't hear you again. Can you move closer?
Yeah. So the New Westminster, British Columbian, and the Vancouver Herald both carried pieces on the resumption of publication. The Herald reported that the revived magazine was, and I quote, gay and well edited in content. It was quite a contrast to the original transition. That controversy over Transition magazine showed that prisoners and administrators saw what was happening in the prison system very differently and interpreted it very differently. Administrators did not enjoy the loss of control over the reform project, and they certainly didn't enjoy the loss of control over its public portrayal. Some wardens even suggested that the press be shut down entirely. Among the wardens' objections to the penal press were that the prisoners were using the press for what they called thresh-rising purposes, by which they meant raising the threshold of prison standards. As we've seen in the exchange columns, the penal press reprinted, prisoner editors reprinted material from other prison magazines from all across North America. And they exposed prisoners to privileges that were available and programs that were available at other institutions, which of course they began to demand for themselves. For example, the prisoners reprinted the reports of inmate welfare committees at other institutions, so they could see what was happening at those institutions in the minutes of those committee meetings. They also printed the canteen menus, so they knew exactly what was available at the other institutions to purchase, and they knew how much it cost. Well, one warden suggested that perhaps they ought to do away with those penal press exchange columns. So clearly the issue wasn't constructive criticism, because the prisoners were just asking for things that had been granted at other institutions. The real problem was the existence of any criticism whatsoever.
Wardens were also very concerned about prisoners passing hidden messages. And to be sure, the prisoners used the press to do just that. The local gossip columns were particularly cryptic and very difficult for them to censor. And wardens could not figure out a way to stop this. The wardens also didn't like sarcasm very much, especially that which was directed at the police or at the administration of justice. Any criticism that brought the system into disrepute was not tolerated. In the end, Warden Hall from Saskatchewan probably stated the overall frustration in the room most clearly, saying, "I find the penal press one of the biggest headaches we have to deal with." Yet, the penal press was not shut down, nor were penal press exchanges curtailed.
Well, why not? Why didn't they shut down the penal press? Well, for Commissioner Gibson, the major issue was outside publicity. He explained, and I quote, "I think generally speaking, they serve a pretty useful purpose, and certainly they have received a lot of publicity from outside. And if we accepted to discontinue them, I think we would be subjected to a good deal of blank." The stenographer couldn't bring herself to write whatever he said after that. For Warden Cummins at BC Penn, the issue was prisoner dissatisfaction. He said, "Stopping this magazine affects every prisoner, and they will resent this, and you will have trouble in your prison. The thing is that when you're operating, at least when I'm operating this penitentiary, with about 200 bodies that I haven't got cells for, I bend over backward to avoid trouble." Note the impact there of overcrowding and the tension that the warden perceived. That's the quality of life in Canada's prisons at the height of the 1950s reforms.
And in the years that followed, the penal press continued to take an uncompromisingly critical stance on the issues. I'd like to draw your attention to a point, that is the change in understanding about the purpose of the press. If you remember earlier, we said that the prison administrators originally conceived of the press as a means by which prisoners could communicate with them, the administration. The decision to allow public subscriptions came later. By the late 1950s, at least some prisoners thought that the most important purpose of the press was to serve as a means of communicating with the public. It was an astute perception. The public, as we've seen, was the prisoner's key partner in changing the system. Little happened without public involvement. And it was only because of sustained public pressure for change that the Archambault Commission was appointed, because of sustained public pressure that its recommendations were implemented after the war, however imperfectly that occurred. So what we've presented here is a thin slice of the book, but I hope a central theme has been made clear for you. Without the penal press, we would have told a very different story. And it would have echoed stories that have been told before. A story about administrators who tried to introduce a fair and a far-sighted reform program into the prison system. And it would have been a story about uncooperative prisoners who rioted and destroyed that possibility. But the penal press provides a different sensibility. Prisoners and the public played a key role in stimulating reform.
Well, prisoners agitated in the penal press for the realization of their vision of reform. And sometimes they were able to influence the direction of change. So the press shows us that. It also shows us the incomplete and partial nature of the reform program and the ways in which prisoners tried to help make it better. Today, there are only a few remnants of the penal press in Canada. And we really wonder, how would the public know what's going on inside prisons? How would they hear the voices of prisoners today? We also wonder, how much of things really changed? Are we in a worse position today than we were over 50 years ago?
That's where we'll end it with you, with the question that I posed to you at the beginning. Could we be having the same conversation now? But we'll take your questions.
Thank you so much, Chris and Melissa. That was an amazing presentation. I think it's a very valid question. You know, has anything really changed in the past? At our museum, we show the history from our county jail building from 1863. And realistically, things that happened then, people are shocked by, but some of those same issues are continuing today. I really thank you for this really astute collection. Having the prisoners themselves, you know, share their insights, their experiences, gives us this completely other voice compared to, you know, the politicians, the legislators, the commission reports that come out in the press that, you know, they want us to hear. And hearing that other voice, that on the ground voice, is so important. I'm hoping we do have some questions in the Q&A. Let me just have a check. Okay, so one of the questions we have is, what did you think of the prisoner input to the penal press? Were they really trying to improve the system?
Go ahead.
Well, you know, if you can hear me, and I hope you can, I do think that the prisoners were really trying to improve the system. They made a lot of suggestions for improvement, and they cooperated with the administration. And, you know, one of the things that we were talking about the other day, Melissa and I, was the fact that prisoners participated in the staff training college and helped to train the guards who were coming in to work in the prisons. So they were, you know, time after time after time, when prisoners were commenting on policies in the penal press, they were commenting on how those policies were working and how they might be made more effective, and also boosting what they were doing. So, you know, prisoners talked about the events that came into the institutions and said they wanted more of them. Prisoners formed committees and organized the sports inside their institutions. Prisoners worked on inmate welfare committees and communicated back and forth with the administrators to try to improve the situation. And prisoners tried to give feedback on things like parole. I remember reading in one of the magazines about how the prisoners were unable to calculate when they were able to get out of the prisons themselves. And they were asking the administration to make the whole system more transparent so that people could understand it and work towards it.
Yeah, and overall, prisoners are a hopeful bunch despite the conditions they live in. And so we really get a sense of that in the penal press.
Thank you. Okay, so another question we had coming in through the chat. Sorry, let me just pull it up here. They're coming in faster now. How do you think the introduction of neoliberalism since the 1970s has affected on penal reform?
Go ahead.
Well, I think neoliberalism has affected everything. And I think the adjacent piece around responsibilization has too. So, I've said more than once that we've seen a real breakdown in prisoner solidarity. And as these kind of risk management ideologies have taken hold and become entrenched, the prisoners themselves, individual prisoners, are more afraid of acting in solidarity, more afraid of speaking out because it will be held against them. And so I think those kind of rationalities, that kind of, especially the responsibilization and the risk management strategies, has really undermined prisoners' willingness to step forward and even in anonymous ways writing in the press, because they feel like they'll be punished. It'll be held against them in terms of release and reentry and opportunities to participate in programs, etc.
Next question. Do you have any idea how many prison newsletters are currently being published?
To my knowledge, there are 2 penal press publications. One is Out of Bounds magazine, which has been published for the past 40 years continuously. That's out of William Head Penitentiary. And out of Mission Institution, there is a newcomer to the scene that's been going for almost 2 years now, called The Mallard. And you can see both of those on my website, www.penalpress.com. And they both have a very different flavor to them. Certainly, I would say The Mallard is much more critical and much more reflective of the early penal press that we saw. But Out of Bounds has been going for a really long time, 40 years now.
Okay. Next question. Why do you think the administration was so against implementing effective reform policies? What is it a result of trying to adhere to strict financial budgets, or more of a lack of compassion for the prisoners themselves?
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd love to answer this. It's a great question, and I wish I still had it up on the screen here. I'm gonna
just more about it.
No, there was a couple of pieces that I wanted from it to respond to. So, 2 things. First of all, I don't think the administration was actually against implementing effective reform policies. I think they believed in the reforms. If you read about Joseph McCulley especially, he was absolutely dedicated to making it work and actually resigned midway through this the program. And so I don't think that they were opposed to it. I think they wanted these reforms to work. But, in our lifetimes, I think we've seen a lot of cutbacks in governmental programs. But it is the focus on finances, which you mentioned in the question. The focus on finances in the 1950s is absolutely insane. We went through record book after record book after record book. They talk about what the cost of absolutely everything, right down to the penny. And they held the local administrators accountable for every dollar that was being spent. And, we read about 2 decades worth of haggling over whether they should use 15 or 25 watt light bulbs in the prisons because the electricity would cost more. And so I think they were really hindered in trying to put these reform policies into place. But actually, a lot of the people who were in the administration I think they were kind of hindered by a financial system and by certain limits of custodial, trying to maintain certain custodial priorities that prevented them from putting the programs in place properly.
And if I can just jump in, because my abolitionist self won't let me let this question go without saying that you can never, in my opinion, you'll never reform prisons. Prisons need to be abolished because we've watched a century of reform efforts that will never take hold because the fundamental structure is flawed. As long as we have a system that's based on punishment, we will never ever have a successful reform program. All we will ever do is tweak a system that is fundamentally rotten.
From the next viewer, they say, fascinating presentation, Chris and Melissa. Can't wait to read the book. And the question is, does the JPP play a kind of similar role today as did the penal press of the past?
I don't think so. The Journal of Prisoners on Prison, for those on the call who don't know, is a publication that is written by prisoners and former prisoners, and it's an academic peer-reviewed journal. Full disclosure, I'm on the editorial board of that. I just recently took over as the book review editor, so I know it pretty well. I think there's a fundamental difference between that. I think that what the prisoners in the penal press were doing was being ethnographers in the moment. They weren't trying to attach it to a broader academic discourse or a broader scholarly debate. What they were really trying to show people is what their lived experience was. And certainly we get some of that in the Journal of Prisoners on Prison, and I think it's a fantastic resource, obviously. But I think the tone and the intention and the skill sets were quite different.
Another question we have is, are you aware of further reforms being on the table now? This viewer's experience says that things are worse now than in the 50s. Can you take your research further? Is there a role for your research in the future? I know that's a lot.
Do you want it?
Well, I can answer part of it. I mean, I'm not so familiar with current reforms, so that part I can't deal with. But the second part about can you take your research further, one of the limits on our research is the existence of the penal press. And so I think we can take it further. We decided to focus on this particular reform program, and that's what kind of set the bounds for the limits of our exploration this time. But as the penal press faded out, I think that sets a kind of natural limit to I don't know, would you agree to that? Mm-hmm. To what's possible. And so as the press disappeared, you lose the source that was most central to doing this kinds of work.
And I think there is work being done that comes to some of the same conclusions from a different place than us, right? But I think there is work that does say the prison conditions are worse, and we haven't really made any progress. And you know, we're still talking about overcrowding. We're still talking about lack of educational opportunities. We say in the conclusion of our book that we were at Millhaven Penitentiary doing a workshop for the prisoners there. And we discovered that at Millhaven, even if prisoners are paying for their own correspondence courses, only 10 of them are allowed to take them at a time. And we were just like, but you're paying for your own correspondence course. Why are you limited? And so it just was this arbitrary rule that had been put in place to limit participation. And Chris and I just shook our head. And then as you look down the cell blocks there, we could really just remember all the writing of the early writers who talked about pacing in their cells and being caged and the sense of hopelessness that comes from those kind of conditions. So I think, I don't know who posed the question, but I tend to agree that we haven't gotten anywhere.
Next question. If the record-keeping practices of wardens and penitentiaries did not exist, would a lot of what you spoke about this evening ever come to light? I wonder how many records might have been destroyed.
That's a good, yeah, so to start with the main part of the question, I think we needed those records. They're very expensive, and they were on physical media, which was helpful. So they were preserved, and I don't think we would have seen these events in the same way. The penal press is very useful. It has its place. It gives us a certain perspective, but the records of the administration were also extremely useful. And I remember sitting in Library and Archives Canada with Bob Gaucher and Melissa, and Bob was on the other side of the table and he was reading through the minutes of a warden's conference and saying, oh my goodness, it's all here, expletive, it's all here. So there's an awful lot of information in those documents. And it's really, I don't think that we could have done this work without them, for sure.
But if I can jump in here, I will like to say that, you know, all those documents were well preserved, they were cataloged, they were all attached in nice files, and while it was difficult to get them, they were there. And that's in very stark contrast to the voice of prisoners. And make no mistake, if it was not for Bob Gaucher, we would not have the penal press collection. And the penal press materials that used to exist, I think, were culled during the Harper era's hate of libraries, when they were trying to digitize things and not keeping records of the things they decided just to destroy. So were it not for Bob's dogged diligence in tracking all of these down and preserving them, the prisoners' voices would have been completely erased. So we would have had the administrative history that we always have, but we would not have heard from those who had the lived experience to challenge the rhetoric that was being put forward.
Okay, next question. This viewer says, absolutely love the presentation, Chris and Melissa. I'm curious about what you hope will come from the book.
And your sister's proud of you.
Oh, yeah, I didn't say that part. I know that was a public part.
Yeah. You know, I hope that people look at prisons and, you know, back in the 50s, there was a slogan, prisoners are people. And I hope that people can, the readers can see the humanity of the prisoners and understand them as people who had real problems and faced real challenges inside the prison system, and can take that experience from learning about, you know, we can't see the same things in the same way in the prisons of today. I hope they can look at that experience and start to think about maybe what they would like to do and change about the prison system today.
Okay. Regarding the access to educational and vocational programs for prisoners, there was very little offered in the 1950s. Do you know when this changed? And when did or why was access to educational programs, when did that occur? And then this same viewer asks, are you concerned that speaking out as you are and given your book, will it limit your access to going inside prisons in the future?
I keep thinking they're going to cut me off any day now, but I've been thinking that for the past 30 years of working inside with prisoners. You know, the interesting thing for me has been, since I built the website for the Penal Press to help get those materials out there, how many workers in the system have written to me and said, thank you for doing this. There's something wrong in the system. We need to figure out a way forward. And so I think that the people who work in the system know it's broken. And I think where we diverge is in terms of what we see as the way to rectify that break. And so I'm hoping that I get to keep going into prisons, because I think that I do good work there, and that it's useful for the prisoners. We did a presentation like this one, quite similar to this one, with prisoners at Williams Head Institution and at Collins Bay Minimum, I think. And it was great to be able to share it with them, to be able to show it to them, and to get their feedback. And so I hope I get to keep going in. Chris only accompanies me in once in a while. Not his favorite place nor my favorite place to go, but hopefully I won't lose total access, but we'll find out, I guess.
And I'm just noticing the time here, so we're going to take one last question before we wrap it up. This viewer asks, or states, penitentiaries are an invention of the modern world. They did not exist in the medieval world. Melissa, what do you suggest we use instead of prisons?
Well, I don't think it's a matter of what do we use instead of prisons. I think we need to revamp how we see the world. I always ask my students to consider whether the person who was most influential in their life was somebody who supported them or someone who punished them. And inevitably, they always say it was someone who supported them. And so I don't understand how we can possibly build an entire system from education through criminal justice system, through religion, that's based on punishment when we know the exact opposite works. So I think we need to be having a bigger, broader conversation and really getting out of that sense that, well, if we get rid of prisons, then what do we do? It's a bigger question. It's if we get rid of punishment, penology as our central organizing principle, if we move towards support and kindness, then what do we do? Because then we really change society.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate all of the presentation tonight. I know it's a quick hour has gone by, goes so fast. Is there anything you want to say to the viewers tonight, other than to pick up a copy of your book through the Old Jail Museum website? The link is in the chat. Also, if you appreciate tonight's presentation and want to support the museum in being able to present more opportunities like this, you can drop a donation on our website as well. Thank you very much for that. But Chris and Melissa, any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
You know, I'm just having a quick look through at who's on the list, and there's certainly several of our friends and family. And so I think both Chris and I are acutely aware that none of this happens without the support of those people. And so, you know, we try and thank them often, but thanking them again for here. And thanks to Len Husband, who agreed to publish this book and fought to get it through. And you know, especially if Bob's on the call, Bob Gaucher, of course, not one page of this book happens without Bob Gaucher. So, anything from you?
Somebody asked at one point how they could contribute to reform today. Look at
International Conference on Penal Abolition. For those who don't know the abbreviation. And, you know, yeah, there we go.
Okay. I think that is all of the questions we had, and I think we're all wrapped up. I want to thank everybody again for attending this fantastic book launch. Buy the book, see what you think of it. I found it really incredible, and I love that the book starts off with the quote, "Telling the truth takes a collective effort." And I thank you so much for doing that, for pulling together that collective voice to share with us. And I think it's a very valuable addition for people to read and learn more about the prison reform system.
From the museum.
Nope.
People are...
We still